3 years ago, my wife and I, Valerie and I, were on the Greek island of Chios when I suffered a brain seizure. I had contracted herpes viral encephalitis. Fortunately, I don't remember much of the next couple of months, as I was in a coma. I was already back in St. Vincent's Hospital in Dublin when I began to understand how ill I really was. I woke up in the ICU, not understanding or knowing where I was, and not knowing what had actually happened. I was intubated, and I couldn't even speak, and I couldn't move. But my overwhelming memory is one of, and I will never forget this, kindness. There were nurses and carers who held my hand, spoke gently, and reassured me that all was well. And there was music. My favorites were being played even before I was conscious. And when I woke up, I was extremely confused and convinced that my delusions were simply reality. One night I thought the hospital was on fire, and I told the staff to evacuate, but I couldn't understand why they weren't taking me seriously. There were night terrors as well, but someone always with me, ready to calm and console me. I spent 1 year and 3 months in St. Vincent's, most of it in St. Monica's ward. In the beginning, I could not do a solitary thing, nothing for myself, and I was lifted and showered and even tube-fed. The staff became familiar faces when they became friends. There were long nights when we chatted through the dark, and I learned about their lives and their families. I realize how privileged I was indeed to have them spend this time with me. I didn't realize then that they were there to prevent me getting out of bed or doing something equally silly before I could walk. I remember the day I first stood upright as the staff lifted me in a hoist. I could look at my Valerie eye to eye. It was a great feeling, a great feeling. Then gradually I began to move again. I had to learn the most basic things, and the nurses were very patient. the occupational therapist taught me how to use a shower by simply walking in with me. The doctors fed me yogurt to see if I could eat what he had given me. The medical team visited me every day, but often I didn't understand what they were actually telling me. But the nurses and my family came next, and they took the time to explain what was happening. The nurses were absolutely passionate about their calling, because apart from being nurses, they had this solitary gift of bringing out the best in the patients. I'll never forget that experience. I remember one afternoon going out into the corridor with two nurses, and they asked me, "Brian, what would you like to do?" Down the corridor, I got a glimpse of green, and I said to whoever was beside me, a nice nurse, "Is that a golf course out there?" "Yes," they replied, all of the nurses. "And that golf course is out there." And I said, "I can smell the green course," because I was oh, yes, they replied, and I said, "I know it's a golf course, and it's Ellen Park, and that I had played a number of games there." Almost every day from then onwards, I walked down the corridor to watch the golfers, and I couldn't wait to get out there again myself. The nurses looked after us so well, even in the little things which were big things to the nation or to the patients. And when I got a bit better, and the nurses and carers would get me ready for Mass, and my children would bring me down in a wheelchair. Afterwards, we went for tea and buns in the hospital cafe. This became a very important part of my week. On another occasion, the nurses put me into a wheelchair, a bit like an armchair, and I went outside to see my dog, Ben, for the first time in months. Eventually, I moved to rehab in Leopardstown. That was in the Park Hospital, and that was a great eye-opener. It was a boot camp for all the senses. The first thing they told me was, "We don't deliver meals to your bed. You take a walker and you get to the dining room." I left rehab a couple of months, and that was later, much improved, energized, and ready to take on the challenge of actually going home. I am very grateful to all the people who helped me on my journey back to health. But most of all, I will never forget the kindness I experienced in my darkest of days. There is a God, and I found him, and I will never forget that. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Brian has outlined our journey from Chios to Athens to St Vincent's Hospital in Dublin and then on to rehab in Leopardstown Park. It took about 18 months, but I would like to concentrate on the time that Brian spent in St Vincent's. Let me start by saying that we will be forever grateful to the medical teams who literally saved his life. Brian's condition had gone undiagnosed for almost a week on the island of Chios. So he didn't receive the appropriate medication until we got to Athens. We arrived in Dublin by air ambulance on a summer's night. It was a surreal experience. The entire plane is a mini ICU, stripped of all essentials. Even the toilets are gone from the plane. I sat on a seat at the front of the plane while Brian lay on the opposite side on a rigid stretcher with tubes and cables coming from the roof. The doctor and nurse kept checking his vital signs and taking blood. I could just see the side of his face and his upturned bare feet while we flew quietly through the darkness. The pilot chatted away to me and the nurse produced donuts to keep us going. Arriving at St Vincent's, we were met by a team of medics. We knew the prospects were not good, but the staff immediately took the whole family under their wing. And it was the first time in 2 months that I felt I could confidently entrust Brian to the care of someone else. Brian remained in ICU for a number of weeks, and we were so impressed, not just by the level of care he received, but by the way he was treated, as though he was fully conscious. As a family, we took turns to stay with him. We played his favourite music in the hope that he could hear us, and staff gave us detailed updates all the time. But you know, by its very nature, ICU is a very tough place to be. Those early weeks were full of heartbreak and hope. We read everything we could about herpes viral encephalitis. We joined the Encephalitis Society in the UK. Then one day, Brian regained consciousness and tried to move his lips. The tube was removed from his mouth, and a good friend who works with deaf people and who could lip read was there with us. And Brian was saying over and over, "Am I dying?" So we were able to say, "You were, but not anymore. You're getting better." I could talk for days about this, but I'm very conscious of time, so I'm going to take some shortcuts with Brian's care. Amazing things began to happen. The nurses in ICU found a way to wash Brian's hair. The physiotherapist, the occupational therapist, they all started working on him, and he became more and more alert. Then he was moved to a ward, which was very busy, and where he picked up every hospital infection going. So for days he was delirious, not knowing anyone, and even creating his own language. And of course, doing the famous, "The hospital is on fire, everybody, please evacuate." Then he was moved to St Monica's ward, where he spent almost a year. He began to improve, and instead of being peg-fed, he was given pureed vegetables. Now that might seem like a tiny thing to you, but the catering staff were amazing, because whether it was orange-coloured puree or green puree or blue puree, it didn't matter. It was actually sculpted into the shape of the original vegetables, and Brian felt he was having real food. But then, as Brian began to improve, we got the impression that the decision makers didn't quite know what to do with him. There were regular family meetings with the team, and it was at one of these that a consultant sprang the news on us that Brian had peaked and would be moving permanently to a nursing home. At this stage, Brian was just off being peg-fed and he was still being lifted with a hoist. Not only that, but they said they'd help us to get the Fair Deal scheme. I was there with my 5 adult children, and we made it very clear that Brian would be coming home regardless, and that had always been the future, regardless of his level of recovery. Then we were told that we would never be able to take Brian home because he didn't have a medical card and we couldn't afford the very expensive equipment that he would need. Things went from bad to worse from then onwards with some of the professionals. I asked for a second opinion from a different discipline. He came along, met Brian, assessed him, and when I went to meet him, his first words to me were, "Valerie, you have to accept that Brian has had a wonderful life." I was absolutely dumbfounded. There was definitely an element of ageism in the conversation around Brian's future. When Brian became ill, he was 73 years old. So I was having trouble knowing what's going to happen next, because all they kept coming up with was nursing homes, nursing homes. And I was saying, no, Brian needs boot camp, he needs to go home. So I started researching rehab myself. I went out, I spoke with the director of the National Rehabilitation Centre in Dunleary, and I was quite shocked to discover that they only take under 65s. Brian at this stage was 73 or 74. But they told me that they offered to assess Brian. They said the odd person does actually get in. But I was told then, when they contacted the hospital to assess Brian, I was told by a consultant that I had gone behind their backs and they would decide what was best for Brian, not me. This paternalistic attitude caused us a lot of annoyance, and we had to fight several times, again, always against that background of the suggestion of a nursing home. And getting rehab for Brian wasn't easy. With the help of one of the very decent consultants, I'm happy to name him Dr. Christopher McGuigan, who had believed in Brian and in his potential from the moment go and conveyed that all the time to us as a family. I went researching every rehab unit I could find. I visited them. I went online to the UK, Japan, Germany. And then Dr. McGuigan suggested Leopardstown Park Hospital, which is a very tiny rehab unit. And the rest is history. We were so lucky to get in there. They did a wonderful job. And as Brian says, they provided a boot camp, the boot camp I knew he always needed. Now, back in St. Vincent's, during these family meetings, there was a very helpful social worker from the HSE who attended those team meetings. And when she realised we were definitely taking Brian home, she took our wishes as a family very seriously. She arranged for our home to be assessed. She gave us advice on the changes we needed to make, and she even organised the provision of a carer when Brian went home. Brian said the nurses and carers in St. Monica's became our friends. And I can only add that they went well beyond the call of duty in their care and the hope that they gave us as a family. They pushed Brian to the limit in terms of retraining, and they worked with us when we came up with ideas, and they took care of us too. One of the big lacks in St. Vincent's that we discovered was there is no dental care, there's no emergency treatment. And going into a bank holiday, Brian had a broken tooth on a Friday, very badly broken, a jagged tooth that dug into his mouth, and he was bleeding. And they couldn't do anything, there was nobody. And I spent the entire evening ringing every doctor in Dublin, or every dentist. And eventually I found a dentist who had a clinic on the Saturday morning, and he agreed to come into the hospital and look after Brian and made him so much more comfortable, did a temporary filling. That is something I think should be taken on board. Now, some of my comments might be seen as negative, and that isn't my intention. I know that staff are overworked and that opportunities and facilities for older patients are scarce and difficult to access. But it might be worth taking on board that our family, and I'm sure many others, would be willing to work with the team in having a patient return home. It's certainly an area that needs further work. We had to challenge the we know best attitude of some of the professionals. And feeling that these people are pulling against you can be soul destroying. What I've learned is that it's not enough to heal someone's body. It's not enough to package the patient and find a slot in the system that suits the system. Ageism, of course, is not confined to the health services, but it is the area which can cause the most damage to victims. Brian eventually came home to us, and our lives have been restored. There will always be hiccups, but you can live with that. But I would like to thank everyone for bringing Brian back from the brink and giving him back his life. Thank you very much.